I think all music is influenced by Bach because he's like the musical great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather.
I mostly love playing Bach.
The challenges of singing Bach is what drives me, because it's just fun.
There's so much to be inspired by and moved by.
It's ancient music. It's sanctified music.
There's so much variety in it. I am just taken out by how much there is of it and how many different instruments he created music for.
I was raised a cello player.
Okay.
So Bach was right there in the beginning.
I played two-part inventions, and I don't remember, I was probably 10, 11 when I started on the tuba. And more than any other music, I just knew where it was going.
Oh yeah, all those melismas and octave jumps, yeah, it's fun. It's acrobatic. That's what I enjoyed the most.
It just fell into my hands like it was supposed to be this.
I play the violin, and it's so much more than the violin. It's everything.
The variety and the depth, it's just like, I feel it in my bones, so I can't be that different from others. I feel that it's accessible in some way to everyone.
I've done my best to introduce Bach to my 3 children, and the eldest, who's now 21, said, "Thank you, Dad, for introducing me to classical music." So I think, yeah, it can be for everyone, even the most reluctant.
Hi, I'm Nick Phan, and this is Bach 52. When we talk about Bach, it's so easy to get lost in superlatives. The greatest composer ever, a universal genius. A before Bach and an after Bach. And sure, there's truth to all of this, but what happens when we examine the mythologies that we've built up around Bach and actually let Bach be who he was? Last year, I had the chance to sit down with Bach scholar Michael Marissen at the Baldwin Wallace Bach Institute, which is an annual Bach festival that takes place at Baldwin Wallace University in Ohio every year. We sat down in the library of the Riemenschneider Bach Institute and had a fascinating conversation. Michael is known for asking pretty uncomfortable questions about Bach's theology, the times in which he lived, his historical context, and also about the stories we've built up around Bach's music. In this conversation, Michael and I talked about how Bach is really a pre-modern thinker. We also talked about how joy and sorrow and all sorts of seemingly contrasting emotions can live side by side in his music simultaneously. And we also talked about how tempting it is to turn Bach into some sort of personal hero whose value system conveniently aligns with our own. Something I found really refreshing about Michael is that this was not a conversation about tearing Bach's music down or tearing him down as a historical figure or deconstructing his work. Instead, it was about using a deeper understanding of Bach to enrich our appreciation and our connection to his music. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and please, as always, be sure to stick around for the aria at the end of the episode, taken from Cantata 179.
Thanks for doing this. I always start this kind of just wondering how people come to Bach's music. And, you've written so much about his music. I'm really curious to know what exactly it is that, how it came into your life and just sort of the journey of getting to from that moment until where you are now.
Well, it's an extremely unlikely story. And my spouse writes commercial fiction. And so we know a lot of literary people in New York, and people always say, "Oh man, you got to write a memoir about this." And I really don't want to do that. It's just the last thing I'll ever do.
Well, let this be your memoir.
But people do find the general arc of it sort of interesting. And the upshot is I grew up as an extremely conservative community of Dutch immigrants who came to Canada in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And they were extremely strict Dutch Calvinists, basically, not the cool Calvinists. They're not like the Dutch Reformed Church in the Netherlands. Mostly farmhands all the way back to the Middle Ages. And were very serious people and very and good people, but they had not only no interest in the arts or in education, they actually were extremely skeptical of it. The upshot was that all you really needed, although the government made you get more schooling, this was, 4th or 5th grade, so that you know math well enough to deal with money and reading enough to deal with the Bible, and anything beyond that is just going to create trouble. And the church itself, they had this very strict church with no paintings, no statues, no choir, no nothing. Very, very, and just a long service, very focused on preaching on the word. And so this is not a likely environment in which to get exposed to Bach. But there was one elderly gentleman in that community, must have been very lonely, and he did have a small record collection. I don't know how many, but fewer than 10 perhaps. But one of them was a Bach set of Helmut Walche playing with the Bach organ works. And a friend of mine over, I don't know, was 10 years old or so, and this guy said, hey, boys, come over here, listen to this. And he played for us the Passacaglia in C minor for it, and we were just both gobsmacked. I mean, it was like, wow. Because we were just not accustomed to listening to music. And this is like this repeated bass and harmony pattern over and over again. We were just like, our jaws dropped. And we said, do you have any more of this? And he said, oh, yeah. And so we hung out listening to, it was just the Bach organ works. And then I worked in hard manual labor and saved up my money and figured out how to get over to a record store in a town that was 50 miles away. I said, so I bought I think my first, got as many cantatas as I could. And so I think the first one I got was Karl Richter and the Municher Bach Choir doing Herzen, Mut und Taten Leben, in 47. Well, I just thought, man, even the organ music was great, but the cantatas, and then so I ended up going to one of these Dutch Reformed high schools too. And it just happened that the music teacher there, they introduced music, but only singing simple sort of choir stuff and so on. But he was a virtuoso organist, and so I got to turn pages for him, and he could play all the Bach organ works, and that was just fantastic. But probably the most influential thing on me in my whole career in the Bach stuff was discovering the Leonhardt and Harnoncourt cantata series, because it started just as I was a teenager, and I got them one by one all the way to the ends. And so it's high school, college, and grad school. That's the time that it took them to record them. It was always a big event, when a new box came out with 4 more cantatas and they included the scores in there. And it was just like a happening.
Wow.
So I got really good, and not to carry on about this too much, but I was also discovered that I was not very good at manual labor. I respected people who were good at it.
Okay.
I thought I really need to make sure that if there's any possibility that I can get away with not going back into that. So I decided to go to college, and no one went to college in the town that I went, and said, I'm going to go to college and I'm going to study music and I'm going to study German, with the sole function of the German is not to read Goethe or to speak with people in German. It was to be able to understand the cantatas as they're going by in real time. That was the goal.
Wow.
And I really loved taking these German classes and so on and so forth. So I was really into the music and the text. I was very devout and so on and so forth. It was a source of aesthetic pleasure and so on that would have been frowned upon, as I say, in that group. But it was also a source of genuine spiritual devotion. So it became very, very much part of my life. And then I applied to graduate school, went to Brandeis, and they gave a full fellowship, and we study whatever you want. I was, oh my God, I died and gone to heaven. And since I thought this is my one shot, thinking of the Hamilton thing, if this is your one shot. So I said, I'm not going to do a dissertation on the chamber music of Cherubini or whatever, so that's the only time I'm probably ever going to be able to, it's going to be back in the fields kind of thing. So I'm doing a dissertation on the social and religious designs of Bach's Brandenburg concertos.
Wow.
And I got a fellowship to study in Berlin, because I joke around a little bit about this. I think the German government feels very guilty, of course, about various things from previous decades. And there's that Marissen. It doesn't sound like a terribly Jewish name, but yeah, but just, I get the sense that pretty much anyone from Brandeis who applied for German research fellowship, they got it. So I got this wonderful fellowship to study in Berlin, and then I basically spent the rest of my career till now ruminating about my CD collection and writing about as many things as I got interested in. But there's 1,200 works, and I gradually sort of came to sort of want to figure out how all the parts of the repertoire are related to each other, because they tend to get sort of balkanized. People say, well, I'm just an instrumentalist, so I'm really into the chamber music, and I don't know about those cantatas, and that seems like a different world. I say, actually, it's not. It seems like a different world, but it's actually the same world. And I tried to get a sense of that, and I've not always been successful with it, but that's what some of the books and articles have been about. And then, of course, partly against my will, got dragged into controversial subjects, so the polemical side of Bach. So I sort of became one of the people who's sort of known for being the guy to talk to if you want to delve into that more deeply. And I can't help wondering if part of the reason that I got into that so deeply is also because it's not confession mode here, but it sort of was a way of atoning for the Dutch Calvinist guilt that I felt for enjoying the repertory so much. So that if I could sort of really lean into the negative side too, that would sort of balance it somehow and make it all okay. To be so devoted to the music of Bach. I don't know if that makes sense, but
No, that makes total sense. I mean, it's, in a way, personally, I'm grateful for it. It's being able to view these. I mean, Bach gets so canonized, right? And he's sort of put on this pedestal, and it's, to question it is anathema to so many devotees. And I mean, there's this sort of fanatical following around him and his music, which, he's a human being, and he lived in a time and with all its faults and all its strengths. And, we have to I don't know, to me, it makes it more magical to look at it the ways in which you're sort of examining it, because it's important.
Well, so how did you get into it?
I got into Bach because I was, I started as a violinist, and when I wasn't super excited about practicing every day as a child. But when I remember hearing the Bach double concerto for the first time, and because in Suzuki, you get to it in book 4 and the second violin part. And I just thought, oh, that is really cool. That was the first musical goal I sort of worked myself towards.
To get you in D minor for 2 violins.
Yeah, exactly. So from there, I was hooked, and I started playing in orchestras around that time, and I saw any opportunity to play Brandenburgs, and I was obsessed with Brandenburg 3 for all of my adolescence.
Yeah,
which
yeah.
I think in retrospect, I think that's so quaint. But the last movement, it's just got such amazing, vitality and rhythm, and as a player, it just it's a chamber music on steroids. So, I got into it that way. And then I, along the way, I wanted to become a singer. And because of this childhood fascination with it, I was, I started to seek out those opportunities. And then, I'm a tenor. And so, evangelists naturally come into your life and things evolve. So that's how I got into it.
Well, I'm very interested that you came at it so profoundly from the Concerto for 2 Violins, because I think that's one of the greatest pieces of Bach, actually. And I often refer to it as sort of one of the slow mode in particular, I think, is one of the most beautiful things ever by anybody.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is your experience of it too, but what I find, it's really only got sort of 2 melodic ideas in it that sort of spun out for, 6 or 7 minutes.
Right.
And my experience had always been, and other people I've talked to, they have a similar sort of experience, so that it goes on forever and ever and ever and ever. And then when it's done, you go, oh, it's done already?
I know.
How do you do that? That is an amazing, and not only is that sort of amazing from a musical point of view and so on, but I thought I sort of experienced that sort of metaphorical. It's sort of like the way people's lives going. Is that your life is very, very long, goes on and on and on, and then it's over too soon.
Yeah, right.
And so I think, I don't know, I don't speculate on particular, but Bach seems sort of intuitively to understand sort of fundamental things about human life, even in non-vocal music like that.
Very much so. I mean, that piece in a way is all about time dilation, right? It's amazing how he's able to kind of suspend time like that, and yet at the same time make it feel like, no time has gone by at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, something I'm really fascinated about in your writing is, your recent collection of essays, Bach Against Modernity, and I'd love for you to talk about that. It's just this idea of Bach as sort of a modern figure. I think I've heard a lot of people speak about this, and they sort of look at him as kind of a forward-thinking, genius individual. And, I'm very curious to hear your perspectives on this.
Yeah, well, that's a very complicated topic of yours, and I tried to make it simpler in the book to some extent, because I don't want to lose readers or make it boring or anything like that. But I sort of come to think that, Bach really is for everyone. I think. I mean, I have no problem with that. It is in the sense that everyone has the right to him. I'm thinking hilariously of the movie Life of Brian. One of the characters says, I would like the male character says, I'd like to have a baby, And they say, well, you can't have a baby,
Right.
And they argue about it, and then finally one says, well, he has the right to have a baby, even though he can't. So I do really think that everyone has the right to Bach, but I don't for a second believe that Bach valued such an idea, or that he was doing anything particularly to try to reach out to everyone. It just, a lot of it happens to work, partly because it just does.
Right.
It's hard to say really why it does. But also, I think quite often there are very productive misunderstandings of what he's up to, and people have the right to have productive misunderstandings. Sure, I think I have no problem with that. The only problem I have, and I really tried to push this with the students that I was in the 25 years that I was teaching full time, I says, look, you have the right to your views, you have the right to your politics, all these things, but you don't have the right to make someone your hero who's not your hero. It's very tempting because it looks, that guy looks like your hero, but the reason why he looks like your hero is because you don't actually know enough about him to know
Right.
what he's actually up to. And also partly this is sort of human failing that we all have to, is that one, it's sort of natural to see yourself in things that you like.
Indeed.
And so, and again, the vast majority of Bach's music really does, work pretty well for everyone who wants to and has the right to it. So, every few years someone writes a new Bach biography, and there's some really good ones out there. And I always recommend, particularly if you want to know all the information, by far the best thing is to read the Christoph Wolff biography. Is treasure trove of information about Bach and so on. And if you want a really good survey of the music and his life, this new biography by David Schulenberg is very good, which is much shorter. But when no one is quite done yet, and I have some speculations on why they wouldn't do it, there's some practical reasons, but there aren't only practical reasons for this. People have known since the 19th century that Bach had a very large, or for a musician at least, a very large personal library of what they usually call theological books now, but they're really sort of Bible commentaries and devotional books. They're in small format, for example, not the big scholarly book thing and so on. But it's a larger library than a lot of pastors actually had in the 17th and 18th centuries. And all the evidence is that he read them very carefully. He quotes them. The one book that survives is the a 3-volume Bible that the 17th century theologian Abraham Kalov basically printed the entire Luther Bible in large script and then put in smaller script between each of the verses, whatever his favorite, what he thought was Luther's best comment on that verse, if Luther commented on it more than once. And if Luther didn't comment on that verse at all in his voluminous writings, then Kalov basically said this is what he would have said had he got around to commenting on this verse. And that particular book, that Bach's own copy of that survives. It's here in the United States, and it has tremendous number of underlinings and highlightings and marginal comments and so on. And some of those, many of them have nothing, actually probably 90% of them have nothing to do with music. And not directly, at least,
Right.
Not about musical, technical, or aesthetic things that are specific to music, but they have import for that, of course. And those annotations sometimes quote from the other books that are in that library. So it's very clear that he really cared about this stuff and read this stuff carefully. And so to really get a sense of who Bach really was, you would have to really read this stuff carefully and integrate it into the big picture. But people don't want to do that because either they're, but frankly, some people are just lazy.
Right.
It's a lot of work. I don't blame them particularly.
Right.
And some of these books are not that interesting to read. but a biographer often has to do a lot of grunt work that's not that interesting to get to the big picture.
Right.
Once you really steep yourself in that literature and see how it's actually very profoundly reflected in not only in the vocal music, but in the instrumental music, then the idea that somehow Bach is a forward-thinking philosophe of the Enlightenment is absolutely ridiculous, because all of the central things that you learn in college about what the Enlightenment means, being concerned with reason over revelation, wherever that issue comes up in the Bach vocal works specifically, or in the writings, or even in his comments, he takes a harsh view. Oh, of course, you must know there's that fantastic aria in Cantata 178 where it says, Schweig nur, schweig taumender Vernunft, just be quiet or shut up, tottering reason. And, some of my colleagues have said, well, he just had to do that to please his conservative employers. But in fact, in the depths of his heart, he was really a forward-thinking mathematical genius and so on and so forth. And I said, no, we know that's not true, because these annotations that are in this book I don't know why this hasn't been sort of figured out before, that they're mostly entered in the late 1730s and 1740s, so well after he's composed the cantatas. Now, it's conceivable that if he had written them, all those things in there before he wrote the cantatas, he was just, in case the equivalent of the Stasi in the 18th century had come into his apartment and said, we're looking for evidence of what your views are, and that would provide evidence that he was genuinely interested in these things, even though he wasn't, because he really wanted to be a forward-thinking Enlightenment thing. But the fact that they're 10, 15 years afterwards, when there's no need, and there's some of these books also say that, well, these annotations are now useless to us because they don't help explain how he came to write the cantata. But that's backwards. I mean, my view is that what they do is they confirm that what's talked about in the vocal works of Bach is something he's genuinely interested in, because he's studying that as a person, as a human being in the 1740s, when he's not composing cantatas anymore. He's still interested in those issues.
Well, and also, I mean, the cantatas are so, part of the reason we're focusing on the cantatas is, I mean, it gives you sort of like a daily, or it's kind of his daily work or weekly work. And so it kind of gives you a sort of more granular sense of what he was thinking and experimenting with. But also, I mean, they're so, they're experimental. There are places where he's learning things, and there's places where he's forming ideas. And the idea that they're just musical ideas and not also, sort of philosophical and theological ideas is kind of, I mean, I don't know how you could spend 5 years steeped in that depth of religiosity and not be thinking about those things.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up too, because one of the other things I've been very interested in a lot of my, in my Bach journey, so to speak, is that, we were sort of taught too that what a composer does is reads this poetry, figures out what sort of the general emotional tenor of it is, and translates, this is an unfortunate term, but they find a way of expressing that musically. And so the function of and it's kind of lousy poetry, I mean, who are we kidding? From a aesthetic point of view, the poetry is not very good, but the ideas in it are important to the community that they're written for. And the idea is that Bach then finds a way to express the emotion that's in that text in an extremely powerful way that is both emotionally and aesthetically satisfying. And he certainly did that. I mean, there's no question. But where it gets interesting is there's a discrepancy between the musical setting and the text. And people say, oh, he's asleep that day, or he doesn't really care about the text. All he really cares is he really wanted to write something sad here, and he thought this is time for something sad. So, I don't care what the text says. I'm going to write something sad here. But when in those cases where that sort of thing happens, it's often sort of this Lutheran sort of thing. The theology that's behind it is often has to do with things look, or it could be the other way around. There'd be a really sad text, but it's a happy setting. Actually, that's more common in Bach. And so it's like, he's not paying attention to but no, he is, because what he's saying is that things look bad, but in fact, underneath it, everything's actually be okay. In fact, my favorite example of this is a tenor aria in Cantata 13, Meine Seufzer, Meine Tränen, where it's this, it's in D minor with all sorts of chromaticism, and just very, very, the affect of the piece is very, very dark and sad and so on. And it seems like it's in fact just expressing musically what the text is saying. There are so many tears that I can't count them. Oh, we're done. But as it happens, it has a sort of recurring bass line, the same pitch in the bass over and over again, and parallel thirds and sixths over and over again in the recorders, while the oboe da caccia is all over the place. And, that's a topos from Baroque opera, to have a repeated bass line with parallel thirds and sixths. It's a pastoral topos. So behind the text and behind even the affect of the musical setting, there's this thing going on that is saying, no, it's not all negative, despite what the music sounds like and despite what the text is saying. There's something positive behind. And that's a correlative of sort of what Luther said about making sense out of why Jesus dies on the cross. He says, when you contemplate Jesus on the cross, you're seeing the backside of his glory. Which the idea comes from Moses going up Sinai to get the Torah, the Ten Commandments from God, and he's not allowed to look directly at God. He's like this. He can sense in his peripheral vision that there's something very special over there, because if you behold the glory of God directly, you die. And so Luther really liked this idea of things sort of having an element of things being the opposite of what they sound or look like, and that's hard to sort of account for in Enlightenment, scientific. This is a very old-fashioned, pre-modern sort of way of thinking. And it's true, sure, that aria we were just talking about, it's sensational in a concert and people will enjoy it tremendously. But without someone coming along to explain this background, and also I want to be really clear about that. They say, oh, well, that's sort of interesting, but you don't really need that. Well, it's not for me to say what you need or don't need.
Right.
But what I would say is that my experience has mostly been that when people are told about these kind of extra things, they like the music even more. It seems even richer, quite apart from whether they actually agree with what's being said. It's like, oh, wow, that's really nuanced and interesting. And they have a sort of renewed respect for the depth of it all. And I think that's all to the good. My motivation isn't to get people to become Lutherans by any means. It's just to understand what your hero is actually up to.
Yeah, right, of course, and to sort of get their intention, be clear about their intentions. I mean, it's interesting that the thing you're talking about in terms of like holding this, something that seems sad or horrifying or whatever, but then there's this positivity with it. The aria from the tenor aria from the St. John Passion immediately comes to mind, where you're talking about like these scars and like whip markings on the back of Jesus, but like there's such beauty, and consider the beauty in there and consider what this means for us. And I mean, that is, like you say, it's not a rational, reasoned way of thinking. I mean, the other thing that I find interesting about it is that when people argue this, I always kind of come back to these musical forms that Bach is hanging onto. I mean, even if you kind of like, it's so fascinating to know about the text to support this, because I mean, that he's examining in these sort of writings that you're talking about in the annotations in the Bible that kind of illuminate this thinking. I mean, he is clinging to these outmoded ways of making music. I mean, as people move into the Enlightenment, people are, again, we're looking for reason. So like 1, 4, 5, 1, like easy harmonic chord progressions that the ear can discern, and like clarity. And, Bach is not that. Bach is fugues and, endless counterpoint that almost never resolves. And
well, have you ever heard the Johann Sebastian Bach violin sonatas? And forget which opus it is, opus 10 or 18 or something. It's hilarious. The first movement of the first sonata is in B flat major, and it rips off the theme from the first partita for harpsichord of Bach. Of course, and so the Bach piece is 3 measures and 5 measures and 7.5 measures. It's like going almost into Q flat minor, and then fragmented, and then upside down. It's like this totally baroque kind of thing. And the J.C. Bach takes it and puts it into antecedent consequent phrases, and sort of enlightens. It's a terrific example of taking this baroque thing and making it enlightened.
Fixing it.
Fixing it.
Yeah. I know that we misuse the term modern and confuse it with contemporary, but there's something that really fascinates me about your musings about him, is that in a way, I find his stubbornness about looking backwards and sort of insisting on this sort of, pre-modern kind of way of thinking and holding complexity and revelation versus reason. That in a way, it is more of our time than maybe it was 15 years ago.
Right.
There is this thing. I was speaking with Jeremy Dank about this on an earlier episode, and he said, I think Bach is really quite current right now because it seems so algorithmic, and that resonated. But also there's this part of, he's asking us to sit with the messiness of life and, have faith that there's something good on the other side, but, we don't know. I mean, part of the thing that's inherent with faith is not knowing. So, I mean, I just wonder if that resonates with you too.
Yeah, totally, because it actually reminds me of something else that, I mean, not that I'm not an originalist by any means, and it's not all history, but I think history is very relevant. But I think that people often say, why is Bach so well-known and popular and so on, and if indeed he is this pre-modern figure? It doesn't make any sense. I say, well, it's because, and I'm totally in agreement with it, we take from him what we can use and what we like, and so on and so forth. And what people like, especially nowadays, and as you're just talking about in the last 10, 20 years, especially Americans, but it's catching on, American ways of thinking are catching on, or maybe catching on isn't the right word. It depends on your point of view.
Proliferating.
It's a disease or whatever, there are various ways of looking at it, but it's spreading for sure.
Yeah. And
the basic idea is, even when I'm reading like the New York Times and they're talking to various officials who are experts on things, they often say, I feel or I believe. There's nothing wrong with feeling things and believing things, but you don't, statistically, it'd be interesting to do this word study, but increasingly less common for people to say, I think, And folks say, well, the reason that the Bach is so appealing is because the emotional power of it is so overwhelming. That's the sort of the main thing. But behind that emotional power is also an unbelievable sort of rigor and excellence. And when you combine those two, the emotional power becomes all the more emotionally powerful. And that's what I think people are mostly focused on. They try to justify it with talks about math and so on, but that's another topic. But the thing that I want to point out is that when one of those annotations where Bach talks about what the purpose of music is, he zeroes in on the temple choir and orchestra in the ancient temple in Jerusalem. And there it says that at the sound of the trumpets, the Gnadengegenwart, that is the grace presence of God, which is invisible, is summoned from wherever it is and comes into the smoke that's in the temple and occupies it there and fills the temple with God's grace, is the idea. And Bach says that, the function of a modern cantata is the equivalent of that. The sound of the cantata summons the grace of God that then comes down into the believer's heart. And so some people are familiar with that. They say, well, there's your proof that it's all emotional because it's the heart. It doesn't talk about the brain. I say, well, yeah, but this is a really good lesson in history because in Bach's day, the heart was considered to be the locus of the intellect and the emotions. Is the point. And where did he get that idea from? From the Bible. Because in the Bible, the heart is the locus of the emotions and the intellect. In Bach's own mind, the function of music is to combine the intellect and the emotions in the service of improving people's lives and so on and so forth, but in a very specific spiritual way. So the beauty of it is that Bach's music manages still to do that without you necessarily having to agree with what it is that he thinks your life is supposed to be focused on. I think that's the basic idea, that one of the reasons that Bach is so well loved and so on is because wittingly or unwittingly, it has to do with that combination of intellect and emotion.
Right.
And some people overemphasize the intellect and some people overemphasize the emotion. And I think that very difficult balance is what's sort of at the essence of Bach. I mean, there's other composers who are even more emotional. I mean, Handel could reach depths of emotion that I think even Bach couldn't touch. But I also think Bach could reach depths of intellect that Handel couldn't touch.
Right.
And I'm glad that Bach's not the only composer. He's my favorite composer, of course, but and many of the viewers, I suppose, favorite composer. But that makes me want to ask you a question too. I mean, you were saying all sorts of different music all over the place in the classical repertoire and non-classical, but am I wrong? This series that you're doing, or this type of series that you're doing is just on Bach. You're not planning a series on Haydn or Handel or the Beatles so why do you single out Bach from all the great things that you do so well as your focus for this sort of thing? I'd be interested to hear about that.
Yeah, I'm singling out Bach because, there is this assertion, right, that there is sort of before Bach and after Bach in Western classical music and also in general Western music. And, everything, there is this sort of base assumption an assertion that, certainly should be unpacked. But in general, that we think like, everything after Bach is in response to him. And particularly in classical music, in the last few years, it's people have been historically whining about audiences dying forever, and they seem to still be alive.
Right.
But we have that's a big part of our discourse, and we constantly ask ourselves in classical music, is it relevant? And so I feel like by asking this question of Bach, we can more broadly ask it of other people. I don't feel like you can, if we had done Haydn 52, like we would be able to kind of hit the same kind of broad reach.
Right.
And then there's also here we are in Berea, Ohio, where there's this giant Bach Institute that is formed. This is just one example of like the number of places that have become, fascinated and obsessed almost with his music. And
it's not almost, we'll come back to that.
Well, yeah, and I think that like not other composers don't. Maybe Wagner comes close, but again, he doesn't have the same kind of broad reach that Bach does in terms of like touching everything.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to that for a second too, because the broadness of Bach's reach isn't, the fanaticism and obsession associated with Bach isn't just musical either, which I think is very interesting. Sort of reminds me that the three categories that I've run into this the most are Bach and Shakespeare and the Bible, where there are many people who have an obsessive, over-the-top interest in the details of each of these things, but they can't necessarily find a way. They're not necessarily a talented singer like you, or they can't play the violin like Sigurd Kuiken or whatever, or they're not a great scholar like Christoph Wolff, but they want to be able to do something.
Right.
They want to just spend a lot of time with them somehow or other, in addition to the actual listening to it. And, and so I don't think this is true for Wagner, that for Bach, every single manuscript has been pored over extremely careful 100 times by different people, and every watermark and every single ink has been chronologized, and I love it. I mean, I'm not, please don't, I hope people don't get the impression that I'm mocking. It's wonderful info.
It's fascinating.
I'm glad that, and it takes great skill to be able to do that. And I'm glad that someone's doing that. But I think that what unites all of these people together is just the desire to really be around the repertoire as much as possible. And I was very moved by this in that following, for example, what happened to the Bach research centers in Germany after World War II, because they were divided between Leipzig and Göttingen. This whole working out of what the actual chronology was of all the cantatas was a huge, huge project that involved doing the kind of work that I'm just describing. And some people say, oh my God, that's so boring. How could they possibly, how could anyone who actually loves Bach do that? But I think it was an act of deep love of Bach on the part of the people who did that. But also the dark side of it was coming out of the absolute horror of World War II. They didn't want to argue about, whether Bach was this, that, or the other thing, or whether he was really Lutheran, or whether he really loved this, that, or the other. This was emotionally safe. This allowed you to spend enormous amount of time with Bach for hours and hours and years on end, without having to argue about the very nature of interpretation. And so on, and still be doing something useful. It's sad in a way, but the great beauty is that even out of that horror, this really wonderful, useful stuff that came out, so that all of us scholars and performers can completely take for granted the ferocious work that went into making the Neue Bach-Ausgabe,
Right.
And we just take for granted. You go to the music, so you buy your sheet music, and you start rehearsing. It's like,
Now you just get on IMSLP.
And exactly. It's just like so easy, You have no idea. Not you, but I mean.
No, I know. I mean, I took it for granted, and I don't now. But it's interesting. I mean, I think about that just in general with like students, and I was teaching a master class here yesterday, and I was saying, while you're researching, then I was like, oh my gosh, that's so easy for you. You don't have to go to one of these rooms and sit there and devote time to it. You just get on your computer and press a button, and it's there.
Right. Yeah. Oh, which is wonderful.
Which is great. Yes. I mean, information is great. So, we've kind of touched on this, the just general question, but I always kind of like to kind of round out with, the basic question. Do you think the music of Bach is for everyone? And what does the question mean to you?
I do definitely think that Bach's music is for everyone who wants it, for sure. And that, it's not owned by German Lutherans or by Christians in general or by musicians or by consumers. It's not owned by anybody. It really is, in that sense, it really is for everybody. But I don't think that, as I was alluding to before, I don't think that Bach would have thought that was a weird question. He certainly, the historical evidence is overwhelming that that's just not a concept that would have resonated with him. But it doesn't, just because it doesn't resonate with him doesn't mean it can't resonate with us. But I think one of the reasons why it's easier for this kind of art to really be for everyone who wants it is because you don't need the original score for the people to have access to the piece. It's not like a painting or a sculpture or something like this. These extremely difficult ethical issues surrounding whether, and people in England, they'll take better care of those statues than the place that they stole them from.
Right.
In the 19th century. But, it's a tough, if art by nature, by definition, is for everyone, if you think that, then you can argue that, well, England has the right to keep this stuff that they stole because they're going to take better care of it than, or so they say.
So they say.
Than Cambodia or whatever,
Yeah, right.
But from a legal point of view, if you're thinking legally and ethically legally, there's a very strong argument that stuff, that art belongs, that the art object belongs to this other place, and anyone from England and the United States has a right to go see it if they want to go see it there, but it doesn't belong to them.
Right.
So that this belonging thing is a trickier question in other arts than it is in in music, in a way to come full circle. And this, I wouldn't even be sitting before you as a Bach person if it weren't for recordings, because where I lived, there were no concerts. I mean, if there were any concerts, I wouldn't be able to afford to go to them, but there were no concerts of anything, let alone of Bach. So that's how I got to know my entire first 15 years of getting to know the Bach repertoire. It was all through Leinhardt and Harnoncourt and the Kuykens and Franz Bruggen and all those heroes of early music from the 70s and 80s. And so the technology makes it possible for it to be, and you were just talking about the kids doing research.
Right.
Well, I could pull my phone out right now, and if you were wondering about some Aria,
I know we can play it
we
for
can
you.
play it we can play it right now on the. It's astonishing. Even 25 years ago, that was unheard of. Bach has not so much to do with whether the music is for everyone or not, but whatever your view of that music is. And I always told students that, look, there are multiple plausible interpretations of a work of art. That's partly what makes it a work of art.
Right.
There are multiple, but they're not infinite, and they're not arbitrary. So it is actually possible to have an interpretation of something that's wrong, and intellectually wrong, and even emotionally wrong, I think.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and that's very un-American, because you're supposed to be able to, you can choose, you can maximal choice, and however you feel about something, that's sort of your truth. Well, I say, well, but okay, maybe it's your truth, but that's a weird definition of truth, because again, as I say, there's not only one way of looking, but there are a lot of wrong ways of looking at things. But the main issue for me here has to do with the question of authority, because the question is like, what is your view based on? Is it your emotions that are your authority? Is it when you do historical research and you see and you go crazy with the originalist stuff and you're not allowed to think or feel anything except for what is validated by.
Right.
But what is really interesting to me is when people have extremely modern ideas that are very implausible which is no problem per se, but then claim that because this seems so compelling to me, he must have thought that too.
That's dangerous.
And it is dangerous because you don't have the right to make someone, in a way, I don't want to be super moralistic, but this is almost the kind of, I think one of the 10 Commandments, you must honor your father and your mother. Those ancient commandments, some of them, or many of them, they're very profound and very, very good. And they don't mean just literally, the mother that generated your body and your father
Right.
who helped you do it. There's an element, there's interpretations going on of, that's a work of art too, the Torah, and there are many plausible interpretations and there are many implausible ones. But I think one plausible one is you should have some respect for people from the past and don't assume that they thought the way that you did. And in a way, it's actually sort of liberating to realize that you don't have to, you're allowed to think what you want to think. You don't need the authority of Bach, So don't waste your energy sort of like involving yourselves in things that could turn out to be, when you find out that they're untrue, then you end up being shattered. You don't need to be shattered.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. What I love about, honoring your elders does not mean that you agree with them all the time.
Right, no, of
and it
course
does not
not.
mean that we put them on pedestals. It just means that we give them the respect of, you can't non-consensually change the meaning of something that they've done.
Right.
They're not there to debate you. That's not fair to them,
Right.
especially in the case of Bach. So, I think that that's a really fascinating and interesting concept. And again, it's something that, honoring is an invitation to be in dialogue with.
Right.
And I think that that's really important for us to hold. If we choose to put something on it, at least let's own that that's what we're doing.
Right. No, exactly. I couldn't have put it better myself.
I'm just reflecting what you say. So, yeah. Do you have anything you want to add?
I've always been interested by the audiences of the Leipzig Bach Fest, for example, because it's sort of the pilgrimage
Right.
for people from. Have you sung there? You must.
I've sung in Leipzig. I've sung at the Thomas Church. I have never been to the Bach Fest.
Yeah, it's amazing. As people come from all over the world, and they're all these, they're fanatical in the ways that we were talking about before, and it is a really beautiful thing to see. Because you don't see that in Europe so much. And here in America, of course, it's wonderful. You have these American ensembles of, this nice small chamber choir, 12 people, and you see Asians and blacks and whites, singing Bach together. It's a beautiful. That is a wonderful thing, and it's rare to see that in Europe, except for at the Leipzig Bach Fest, where people from all and they, not just the ethnic and other diversity, but also the musical diversity of it. I'm thrilled by way that you can adapt. They'll have a klezmer ensemble play the concerto for violin too,
Right.
and then they had this. Last year there was this amazing. This guy from Warsaw who played polka versions on his accordion. It's brilliant, and it's just unending. The thing, it was at Beethoven who said, right, that der ist kein Bach, der ist ein Meer. He's not a stream, he's an ocean. And you see very strong confirmation of that sort of idea at things like the Leipzig Bach Fest. And so I think it would be very interesting if someone wrote a book about sort of all aspects of what's going on there and the history of it, how it all hangs together, because church and state and commerce and so on are all mixed up in ways that would never happen here, and it's just a culturally phenomenal thing. And I wonder if that would actually work for anyone but Bach. That would be an interesting question. So, but I guess it speaks a little bit to whether the festival sort of seems to project very strongly the notion that Bach is for everyone, and even to get the Germans to use a marketing strategy for their festivals, it's a we are family, we are family.
Yeah.
was the and that's some people laugh at. That's actually kind of beautiful too, and that was very nice. There is kind of a Bach family, and that's a beautiful thing.
I certainly felt that all the years I worked with Reeling, and all the travels I've had. It's interesting the way we all get connected.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Great pleasure.
After my conversation with Michael, I kept coming back to this aria from Cantata 179, which for me is one of the reasons why I'm asking this question. Is the music of Bach for everyone through this project? The aria is a fantastic piece of music. It's chromatically interesting. It's a joy to sing. But when you get into the words, the text is quite judgmental. The Bible reading for the Sunday that Cantata 179 was composed for tells the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And basically that parable is a compare and contrast of who's a better Christian. The Pharisee, who puts on a big, ostentatious display of piety, or the tax collector, who just comes in and humbly begs for mercy. This cantata meditates on this idea of performative Christianity, and in a way questions the congregation whether or not they're good enough Christians. And it just makes me wonder, is something that's so judgmental really for everyone? I guess in there is the hope that one can try to be like the tax collector and learn to be humble, and therefore learn to be a better Christian. The translation of the Recitative and Aria is, Christians today are sorely beset. Most Christians in the world are lukewarm and puffed up Pharisees who present themselves as virtuous on the surface and bow their heads to earth like a reed. Yet in their heart is planted a proud egotism. Indeed, they enter into God's house and make the usual observances of themselves. Yet does this make a true Christian? No. Hypocrites can also be observant. The images of false hypocrites can be called the apples of Sodom, which are filled with filth and on the outside shine beautifully. Hypocrites, who are lovely on the surface, cannot withstand God's presence. This music is almost gleeful in its depiction of these hypocrites. Perhaps that's Bach just trying to show how showy and ostentatious these people are in their displays of piety and observance. But there's something in there also that seems to take a little joy, a little schadenfreude, that these people are perhaps lesser than and cannot enjoy God's mercy at the end of the day. I don't know. I think that's for the listener to decide. It's a tension that I sit with and I find fascinating, and it makes me question, is this music really for everyone? Either way, I really enjoy singing it, and I hope you enjoy this performance with Ruben Valenzuela and Bach Collegium San Diego.
Was heut der Christen bestimmt. Die meisten Christen in der Welt sind launische Laodicäer und aufgeblasene Pharisäer, die sich von Haus an fromm bezeigen und wie ein Schiff den Kopf zur Erde beugen. Im Herzen aber steckt ein stolzer Eigenraum. Sie gehen zwar in Gottes Haus und tun da selbst die äußerlichen Pflichten, macht aber dies wohl einen Christenhaus? Nein, Heuchler können's auch verrichten. Ebenbild können Sodoms Äpfel heißen. Falsche Heuchler Ebenbild können Sodoms Äpfel heißen, die mit Unglad angefüllt, und von außen herrlich gleisen. Falsche Heuchler Ebenbild können Sodoms Äpfel heißen, die mit Unglad angewillt und von außen herrlich gleisen. Heuchler, die von außen schön, können nicht vor Gott bestehen. Können nicht vor Gott bestehen. Heuchler, die von außen schön, können nicht vor Gott bestehen, können nicht vor Gott bestehen. Heuchler, die von außen schön, können nicht vor Gott bestehen.